So as the director of Future of Learning and Innovation team at UNESCO, where you currently lead the Future of Education Initiative, a project that is looking towards 2050, and you touch a lot of things right now that is there. But for people that don't know so much, because of course you are deeply involved with UNESCO, tell us a bit about your role and UNESCO, because I think that's a very important people for, first of all, one of the things I learned in my, and I like this for people listening to us, is that people know things exist, but like you said, it's like the language. There's 5 or 6 languages or 7. Actually, that's a very important thing for technologists. But in the end of the day, the diversity and as well understanding the fantastic work that we have, because the media doesn't highlight any of this. So if you could highlight that.
Okay. So that could be also a separate discussion on its own, but maybe useful to recall. I mean, people generally might not know. I mean, the UN and UNESCO in particular was founded just after the Second World War. So after that terrible experience around the world. And one of the most cited articles of the Constitution of UNESCO, just to give the spirit of its birth, is to say, and if one visits the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, they will see that next to an olive tree in the garden, symbol of peace, that since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that we must construct the defenses of peace. So this is like the founding article, if you want, that gives the spirit of the mission of UNESCO. And this peace was seen as being based on the moral and intellectual solidarity of humankind. So through scientific cooperation, cooperation in the areas of science, of culture, and of education. And that's what the 3 E for education, S for science, and the C for culture in UNESCO, the UN Agency for Education, Science, and Culture. So that was the spirit, constructing the defenses of peace through, based on a principle of moral, intellectual solidarity, and fostering cooperation in the areas of education, culture, and science. So the work of UNESCO in these areas, there are several broad functions, I would say, and this would help to explain also what we do specifically in Future of Education. One we call a laboratory of ideas, a kind of observatory function. So it's looking at societal change, different dimensions of societal change, and convening. We are an international organization, so all countries are represented. UNESCO is all the countries represented. That's what it is. It can come together and look and agree, debate, and hopefully agree and reach consensus on implications of different aspects of societal change, and directions that we should take. So that's from the observatory function. We would come to a second function, which is a more normative kind of function of reaching consensus on norms and guidance on, in general, with an ethical lens, and I think specifically on artificial intelligence. In 2021, UNESCO developed a recommendation through this debate, intensive debate among experts, but also among all the countries represented, a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And so to guide any development, engagement in any sector with these new generations of AI systems. So that's a function around the normative, if you want, and there is a function around policy support. Typically in education, UNESCO would be working with ministries of education at the system level, so strengthening policy, planning, and this can cut across all levels of education, from early learning to school education to higher education to adult education, literacy programs, vocational skills development. So these are, I would say, these are some of the functions. In what we do in the future of learning and innovation, we are within the education sector at UNESCO considered to be the kind of think tank to generate ideas, to be monitoring. Most recently, some of you may be familiar with, because it was quite a bit on the media, with the COVID disruption, we had this massive global shutdown of school systems and universities initially. And we monitored that from March 2020. And we warned quite early on about the potential implications and adverse effects of prolonged closures of educational institutions. So that kind of mapping, this monitoring, the recent work we did on the Futures of Education initiative, which was we had both an international commission of some 18 personalities of different walks of life, thinking about looking at a 2050 horizon, not about predicting what education will look like in 2050, but looking longer term. And I think that's what an observatory function is really about. It's we tend to be caught up in our day-to-day work, whatever that may be. And from time to time, we need to just pause for a moment, lift our heads and look longer, further, both looking back, I would say, and looking at longer trends to understand why we are where we are, what got us here, good and bad, and looking longer term. And that's why we set the 2050. It also represents 30 years from about the time the initiative was, which is like a generation. So what will the world look like in a generation? And what do we want the world to look like in a generation? And what does that mean for education? And our initial work on the futures of education, we reviewed, existing debates and literature on anything about the future of learning, the future of education, the future of knowledge. And a few things came out, but one thing that was quite clear is most of that literature, 3/4, 80%, was framed in terms of the world around us is changing because of technology, and therefore the labor markets, and therefore the way we work and live, and as a result, education needs to change to adapt to that. And education is a slow-moving machine. It's always a little bit behind the changes. So most of that discourse was about education needing to adapt to changes around us. But I think the interest of looking, a bit more forward-looking, more foresight at 2050 is to say, on the basis of current trends, what is the world likely to look like in 2050? Is that the way we want it to look? And if not, maybe it's about how does a different kind of education, how can it help us shape an alternative future that would take us in a more sustainable direction, perhaps in a more inclusive and just direction, but in any case that would ensure kind of more sustainable alternative futures that we want. So just to end on that, that's one. I think the second piece on future and future of education is that most of that debate is in more developed countries. Because in less developed countries, we would say there's still a huge challenge in terms of ensuring literacy of the majority, ensuring, enrollment of young people and preparation of such a, Africa, as you mentioned, being, having now the largest share of young people of all regions of the world. So a very young population. So there are these immediate challenges that there's perhaps less of a luxury to be looking at, the future and what needs to change. I think the work that we did with this with the Futures of Education initiative, and which was picked up and used to frame the UN effort around the Transforming Education Summit, is that we need to transform education, and transform is not reform. Reform is, some improvements maybe on the periphery, tinkering a little bit with the system, making it a little bit better. Transform means a more kind of fundamental change. It doesn't mean starting from scratch. We have strengths to build on, but transform would also mean a kind of critical examination of what is really not working. And maybe despite our best intentions, but some things are taking us in the wrong direction in education. We often say education is a solution for everything. greater productivity, it's investment in human capital. It is, more, healthier families. It's like the black box solution to everything. But one could also say it might also be part of the problem. The way we do education might be part of the problem. If we look at climate change, the most educated societies, the most educated persons, us perhaps, here in this discussion, are among those who are contributing the most to climate change. So, it's not a cause and effect, but there are some positive correlations which can be worrying. Just to take that example, but one could also look at it, and we mentioned earlier about, the political aspects of education and how it can be weaponized. That some types of education may contribute also or help fuel polarization of our societies, division, and undermining social cohesion. So that we need transform means a more fundamental change than reform. We have strengths to build on, but we also have to critically examine some of what is not working. And we need to transform, I would say, for two reasons. And one is, it's like having a foot in the past and a foot in the future. The foot in the past is we still have more than 770 million adults who are non-literate. We're in 2023. We're in a digital age. How can we have hundreds of millions of adults in the world today who cannot access or communicate based on writing of any language? So something perhaps is not working. If we look at upper secondary education completion, the world average is more or less 50%. 1 in 2 students who is in upper secondary education does not complete the level. There may be many reasons. There can be harassment at school, bullying, there might be a shock in the family, a change of, but it cannot explain that 1 in 2 students who are already in upper second do not complete that level. So this model, something is not working in the model. We need to admit that and to look at it. Maybe it's our methods, the content, what we're teaching and how we're trying to teach and is perhaps not relevant anymore to young people, in particular in this digital age. Perhaps they see less connection with what they're doing, in secondary school with their realities, their immediate realities, and their own perceptions of the future. So this is part of the transform. Transform, a more fundamental change. It means looking at what that one foot in the past, this continued exclusion from education, something is not working. That is reason enough that we transform education. But the second reason is looking at the future. If we look at 2050 and we say, where are we going? Where are we headed on the basis of, a projection of current trends? And that education might actually be part of the problem, propelling us on these trends, then we also need to transform education in order to shape alternative futures. So this is some of the work that we have been doing, and then more recently, we've always been involved in technology and education, but we might get to that in a minute. But obviously, much more focus on that very recently with, just the way, generative AI kind of burst onto the public scene. I mean, and media attention and public debate, in particular with the release of ChatGPT-4. I mean, it's been around for a while, but let's say in the last 6 months, since the end of last year, I mean, that was on everyone's mind. So our work is not limited to, but there has been a lot of recent focus, obviously, on technological innovations and what that means for education and for the future of education.
Yeah, you touch an amazing amount that is making me think, and I'm sure all our audience, and I think probably we need a pause to just digest, because it first of all, you mentioned the biggest trends in education worldwide. The biggest challenge I didn't know, for instance, is just the fact that in 2 young people, one doesn't finish the studies. That's quite damaging. And as well, 10% of the world population, that's 750 million or more, don't have basic actually learning digital skills. Actually, I'm not talking digital skills, basic learning education, because digital skills is another one. Basic skills, yeah.